Okay, so your TEK for your table of contents is A.8a, solving quadratic equations by factoring. Factoring is something we've already figured out, so should be pretty easy. As we worked on earlier, your first step is going to be to set the quadratic equation equal to 0. Let me make sure this is focused. Most of the time this will be done for you, but for example here, x squared minus 2 is equal to negative x. We have something other than 0 on the right side, so that wouldn't work. You move it over to the left side by changing its sign, so that would be plus x. And then remember, you put it in order from degree, so this is your highest degree because it has an exponent of 2. Lowest degree, and then just your regular constant because it doesn't have a variable. Okay, then you factor. When we factor, we're going to set each factor to 0. So for example, your first factor was x equals 1. X minus 1, sorry. So you do x minus 1 equals 0. X plus 2 is your second factor, so you do x plus 2 is equal to 0. And then you can solve. Well, x minus 1 is equal to 0. That means this has to be positive 1 because 1 minus 1 will give you 0. So that's your first solution. Your second solution, x plus 2 equals 0. Well, this would have to be negative 2 equals 0. So all you're doing is solving for x, and it's pretty easy. Remember, your solutions are where the quadratic has its zeros. So as you can see, you can always go back and check on Desmos. I hope that you do it this way so we can practice factoring, because when you are asked for factors, this doesn't always work. So make sure you are trying to, factor out and practice your factoring. So we're going to do example 1, and then I will do example 5, I believe. Okay. So we have, it says, what is the solution to this equation? When we have x squared, your a term, remember this is a, this is b, this is c. When you have a without a coefficient, meaning there's not a number next to x squared, it is super, super easy. We just do our x puzzle. We remember that on top we put what a times c is. There's nothing next to, there's a 1 next to x squared. So that would be 1 times negative 22, which just means it's negative 22. And then b goes here. Your b coefficient is negative 9. And now we just see what could fit into our x puzzle. So we know we need a number that will multiply to 22, negative 22, and add up to negative 9. Remember, if we're adding and we get a negative number, that means the bigger number has to be negative. So we're going to work on putting the bigger numbers negative. So I know that 1 negative 22 can give me negative 22, because 1 times negative 22. But if I add them, it's not going to give me negative 9. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to try 2. I know 2 can go into 22. 2 times negative 11 will give me negative 22. And if I subtract negative 11 plus 2, or 2 minus 11, I'm going to get negative 9. So I've got my two factors. That's 2, negative 11. Normally, I would do grouping, but because I have this, it's super easy. I know my factors will be x plus 2, and then x minus 11. And it's still equal to 0. Remember, we didn't have to do that step of setting it equal to 0. It was already given to us that way. Okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and solve by setting both of these equal to 0. So x plus 2 is equal to 0. So x plus 2 is equal to 0. That means I would have to subtract 2 from both sides, which would mean that negative 2 plus 2 would give me 0. So x is equal to negative 2. When there's not a coefficient next to x, it's always so much easier, because all you're doing is just the opposite of what is being added or subtracted. So this was plus 2. Our solution is negative 2. X minus 11 equals 0. So I need a number that I can subtract from 11 to give me 0. Well, that's just going to be positive 11. So x equals 11. These are my two solutions, but we're going to go ahead and check it on Desmos. Not the attendance and not my old notes. Okay, so on Desmos, I'm going to type in x to the power of 2 minus 9x minus 22. I'm going to zoom out because I can see that this is a bigger picture, and I can see my first 0 is -2, which is why I had an x equals -2. My next 0 is 11, which is why I had x equals 11. So I know that this answer checks out. Okay? We're going to go ahead and do example 5. Oops, that's not example 5. Okay. Example 5 is a little different because it has a number next to our a term, which makes it just a little bit difficult. So we're not difficult, but just extra steps. So again, we're going to start with our x puzzle, remembering that this is a, this is b, this is c. At the top, we put a times c, which is 2 times 2. That's 4. At the bottom, we put what our b term is, which is -5. And now we just see what two numbers will multiply to +4 but give me -5. Now, if I'm ending up with a positive multiplied number, but negative number here, when I add them, that means they both have to be negative. So I would start with -1 times -4. -1 times -4 will give me +4. And when I subtract them, they'll also give me -5, so I don't have to go any further. Super easy. Once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this equation, sorry. And I'm going to do 2x squared, that stays, minus, I'm going to do my first factor, -1, not my first factor, but my first number from my x puzzle, minus -5. Sorry, this should be 4, -4. -4x, and then plus 2, still equal to 0. Now I can group. I'm going to group the first two terms, make sure the negative stays inside the parentheses, and now I'm going to factor something out. So I'm going to try to divide. Well, I'm going to look at the first two terms, and this is 2x squared. This is -1x squared. They both have an x, so I know I can take out x. So I'm going to start with x. And then I'm going to go to I know what the answer is, but I'm going to go to the calculator because I know you might have a hard time, and I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to get you to remember. So you're going to type in GCF. You had a 2, 1. And your biggest common factor is 1. So you're not going to divide by 1. You're just going to leave it as dividing by x. So then that just means I put an x outside of my parentheses. X squared divided by x. That just means I subtract. So I get rid of one exponent. So now I have just x. And then 2 is not getting divided by anything. So now that's just 2x. -1x divided by x. That's an x on top and x on the bottom. I can get rid of that, and I'm left with -1. Okay. Now I'm going to look here. These two numbers, they don't both have an x, so I can't take an x out. I also know I have a negative as my first term. I know it's hard to see. But my first term in the parentheses was negative, so no matter what, I have to divide out by a negative. Okay? So then I'm going to go to decimals, and I'm going to put 4, and I'm going to put 2. And I know my greatest common factor is 2. You probably already knew that, but again, we're remembering, we're practicing. And if I'm dividing by -2, that's what I put outside of the parentheses. A lot of y'all forget to put outside of the parentheses, and that's where we mess up. Okay? So -4 divided by -2, the negatives cancel out, and I'm left with +2x, because x is still there. And then 2 divided by -2 is -1. Remember, what's inside the parentheses should always end up the same, so I know I did it correctly. So my two factors would be whatever's outside the parentheses, x minus 2, and I'm going to set that equal to 0, and 2x minus 1. And I'm going to also set that equal to 0. Remember, this is super easy because there's nothing next to x, so this just means it's the opposite. So my first solution is going to be positive 2. However, this one's not that easy because there's something next to x, so I'm going to solve like we always used to solve. So I'm going to start with getting rid of what's furthest from the x. I'm solving for x, so I'll circle my x. I'm going to start with my adding or subtracting. So this is subtracting, I'm going to add, and I'm going to add to both sides. Okay? This is a line going through my equal sign. -1, +1 cancels out, and I'm left with 2x is equal to 1. Now I get rid of that 2 by dividing, so 2x divided by 2 on both sides. That's x equals, because 2 over 2 cancels out, x is equal to 1/2. So my other is 1/2. But again, we're going to go and check it. So I'm going to type this whole thing into Desmos and see if that's what shows up. Let's see. I'm going to move this a little bit too. Ooh, hold on, y'all. Okay. So I'm going to type in 2x to the power of 2 minus 5x plus 2. And I can see my first 0 is 1/2 or 0.5. My second 0 is 2. Okay? So I know my answers are correct. Always check them. You're going to go ahead and do the next example. You're also going to see that these examples here need to be put in order. They need to be solved for 0. So you need to make sure that you're putting them equal to 0 by moving over whatever's on the right side. We worked on this earlier in class. Let me know if you need any help.